the Masterclass series, the Founding Fuel Masterclass on the World in 2025. We've just come off a fantastic scintillating session last Friday with a panel that joined us from Washington, D.C., Beijing, Paris, and Mumbai and Delhi. And we're delighted to host the second and the final masterclass today with Mr. Shyam Saran in conversation with our anchor, Dinesh Narayanan. Before I introduce him, just a quick set of thoughts that the last masterclass left us with. It'll be useful to just quickly recap. One was, of course, on the big elephant in the room, the US-China tensions and the geopolitics that are shaping the way. What we heard was that China is seeing both risks and opportunities with the Trump administration's return because they see him as maybe transactional, as a pragmatist, and someone who's willing to make deals. On the other hand, Europe seems to be caught between the US and China, struggling with its own internal challenges while trying to maintain strategic independence. And the US, interestingly, is facing significant financial overstretch, which is perhaps shaping a more transactional foreign policy, particularly in military alliances like the NATO. We also heard about the technology wars and the economic shifts that are playing out, and how the US restrictions is actually propelling China's advancement in AI, semiconductors, and space technology, and making it more self-reliant, some would argue. And how the global power balance is shifting from just military dominance to economic and technological competition. There were three things that shape our emerging global challenges: AI, climate, and migration. All three of them are in some ways interlinked because climate change is driving migration and reshaping global demographics. AI is pushing us towards a slightly unpredictable future where the power of technology could in some ways end up surpassing human control. And I think there was the final point that I think we were left with, that maybe the future will not be defined by geopolitical conflicts, but humanity's ability to govern the existential threats that AI, carbon emissions, and water scarcity pose. So on that note, we've set the backdrop of what we heard. Today's session is really focused on what all these changes mean for India. And we couldn't have had a better person to lead this conversation for us. Mr. Shyam Saran has had a distinguished career as a diplomat and the former foreign secretary in the government of India. But there are many other things about him that you would have read in the spotlight that we shared. I'll just touch upon a few. He was instrumental in shepherding the nuclear deal between India and the US back in 2008, probably the most important milestone in his career. He's also worked as a PM's special envoy for nuclear affairs and climate change, been an ambassador to Indonesia, Myanmar, Nepal, and High Commissioner to Mauritius. I think that his two books will certainly shape the conversation today, because the most recent one on how China sees India and the world, and the earlier one, which is how India sees the world, got earlier to the 21st century, will certainly hold lessons for us as Dinesh engages with him. Dinesh, of course, did a masterful job of anchoring the earlier masterclass last Friday. He's, of course, a dear colleague, an author, and a columnist. And so I'd kind of, before I hand it over to him, couple of housekeeping rules. One is we're sticking to the same format. Those of us who are joining us on YouTube can key in your questions in the chat. My colleague and co-founder, Charles Assisi, will be managing that chat box. He would have already introduced himself there. Some of you have joined us on Zoom as well. We're delighted to have at least one of our panelists, Sandeep Vaslekar, you would have been there last week. You would have seen him. And there's David Judson, who's joining us from Austin, Texas, and Ilmas Fateh Ali, Vivek Kelkar. These are all familiar names for Founding Fuel community. So I won't take more time. I will come back for some announcements later, and we'll take questions after the first 40 minutes are over. So over to you, Dinesh. Please take it away.
Thank you, IG, and welcome everyone. Glad to be here once again. And the last session was really insightful and really enjoyable in terms of the intensity of participation and the insights it brought on. I won't go into much introduction, but straight away jump into it. One of the key perspectives that emerged from the first session was how close to catastrophe we might be. And to repeat and reiterate what the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists said when they were resetting the doomsday clock this year, national leaders and their societies have failed to do what is needed to change course. And Sandeep had pointed out the failure of the breakdown of the international order in terms of agreements and arrangements which were long-standing. And he had said that nations, especially the big powers, are breaking accords and agreements like the Oslo Accords, Russia-Ukraine agreement. There are many which are being trampled upon. Some of it could be from Trump's side and his expansionist tendencies, and some of it could be just a saber rattling. But the president of the world's biggest economy and military power is the one who is doing it. So naturally, it has its consequences. Ambassador Saran, you have sort of situated the US's hegemonic power in the interlude between the fall of the Soviet Union and the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. And then it sort of fades after that. But even though it remains the preeminent power, how do you see the upending of this world order now? And what happens to the institutions which the US had helped found and build over the years?
Thank you very much, Dinesh. I would like to thank the Founders Fuel for inviting me to this interaction. And yes, we are living in very interesting times, as they say, where we are not quite certain how things will evolve in the coming days. But you said that the international order, as we have known it for quite some time, that international order is breaking down. It is breaking down because the very architects of that order are in fact taking a wrecking ball to that order. So it's not that it's being challenged by others. Of course, there is some challenge from outside, but I think the main sort of difference in the situation today is that it is the very architects of the order who now find it inconvenient and therefore wish to change it in a manner which they think will advance the interests of the country. I personally believe that what Trump is doing is only going to accelerate the steady diminution of US influence and power in the world. So if there is a sense that somehow this is going to make America great again, I think maybe think again. It is probably going to ensure that the United States of America becomes a lesser and lesser power as time goes on.
So what you're alluding to is the break between the Western alliance itself, right? A long-standing Western alliance itself.
Well, I don't think it is just one or another phenomena that I'm referring to, because as you know, somebody like Adam Tooze has said, we are actually facing a polycrisis. There are a number of crises which are coming together at the same time, and there are very strong feedback loops between them. So they are mutually, in a sense, reinforcing each other. Mention was made about AI migration. Climate change is very much also a factor behind migration.
Yeah.
We can also say that there is perhaps a kind of a technological, shall I say, arrogance that we see, where it seems as if now we are in an age where AI will find solutions for every problem that humanity is facing, which is really not the case. There is a sense today that we are hurtling down a slope with no kind of constraints, no guardrails, as they say.
Right.
So for countries like India and other countries in the world, the paradox is that precisely at a time when the salience of global issues, cross-cutting issues, cross-national issues, the salience of these issues are in fact rising, the ability of the world to deal with these through global collaboration, through some kind of cooperative endeavor, without which these issues cannot actually be addressed. That is diminishing. So that's the great paradox of our times. That precisely when we need to work together, we need to have some sense of international solidarity, we seem to be moving in the opposite direction. And this is, I think, at the heart of the crisis which we are facing.
At the same time, there is one power rising, right next to us, which seem to be offering a lot of solution to some of these problems which we face today, whether it is climate change or whether it is technological solutions. It seems to be coming up with, it seems to be the one which is innovating and coming up with solutions, but that is again constrained by its rivalry with the United States. How do you see this playing out? And obviously there is a tension from a large section of the United States, which is very, very corporate, profit oriented, and the rules and which they want governing international alliances or agreements relating to or new accords relating to newer technologies there will be a tension between these two. How do you think it will play out?
Don't forget that China's rise has taken place in an extraordinarily benign and congenial, international environment, both politically as well as in the economic sphere. So China's rise is something which is actually the creature of globalization. And therefore, to say that somehow, the breakdown of this order can be of some advantage to China may not necessarily be true. Because once again, as I mentioned, that the nature of the challenges which we are facing. So you take, for example, climate change. It is a very, very classic global, challenge. I always say, India is accused of being one of the major emitters of greenhouse gases. We have some say 7% of the global total. Supposing by some miracle this 7% became zero tomorrow, would climate change stop?
No.
So even that making it zero, it will not stop. So even if China, I agree, is doing great work in terms of, for example, expanding renewable energy. It is the leader in solar energy, for example. It is a leader in wind energy. So no doubt about that. But to think that somehow or the other this insulates China from what is happening around the globe, I think would be a mistaken assumption to make. So even China has to be mindful of the fact that the kind of challenges that it is facing, or how can it leverage the technological innovation that you're talking about, or the great successes it has made in various spheres, how it is able to leverage that still demands relatively ordered and a relatively, benign kind of international environment, which is what is, in fact, getting undermined.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, China is still less than 20% of the world's economy, while US still has a 28% share. I mean, between these two itself, there is, you know, they pull quite a lot of weight in the world. Now, the last session, Professor Yang was saying the US always looks at China through a certain ideological prism, and that doesn't change. And which is the reason, and he's one of those who are in the group of believing that there is already a Cold War between the US and China. And that is not going to change according to him. And if that is the case, the US will always see China as a rival, and then India probably as a counterbalance to China. If that is the situation, what are the strategic choices we have, and how do we or evaluate our foreign policy choices and so resolve our dilemmas here?
So I'm not so sure that the description of the China-US relationship as another Cold War is necessarily accurate. So one, you find that at least as far as the economic sphere is concerned, China and the US are still joined at the hip, which is very different from what you had during the Cold War or between the United States and the then Soviet Union. And don't forget that in China's rise, the United States played a very important role. After all, if the United States of America did not give access to China, to its market, did not give access to China for technology, did not give access to the Chinese students, large hundreds and thousands of Chinese students who went to the top universities in the United States. I mean, the sheer sort of investment in Chinese brain power, which took place during several years, this is perhaps unprecedented in history. To sort of look upon China and the United States being ideologically, confronting one another, that's not necessarily the case and may not have been the major driver. I mean, the major driver to begin with was, a common threat perceived from the Soviet Union.
Yes.
How, the 1972 visit of Nixon took place. There was a very strong, a convergence between the two sides with regard to the then Soviet threat. By the way, at that time, there was no economic and commercial, driver to begin with. The reforms in China started in 1978. So from 1972 to 1978, the economic factor was not the main factor.
Yeah.
It is only much later that the economic and commercial factor became important in the relationship. So we should not forget that particular phase. What is certainly happening today is that yes, China has made remarkable development strides in its not only on the economic side, but on the technology side. It has gone about it in a very focused way. So we must not underestimate the importance of that, because it has, in a sense, shaken up the international order. So the kind of, a certain kind of stability which was there in the system has been disturbed by the rise of China, and the United States of America is reacting to that rise. But in reacting to that rise, the United States of America, certainly under Trump, seems to be taking actions, seems to be, responding with policies which ultimately undermine the very objective it is trying to achieve.
Yeah.
So even if you're looking at, how to constrain China in some way, if not contain, at least constrain China in some way, the alliance systems are very important. They are an asset for the United States of America. Now, Trump is going about undermining those very assets that it has in terms of dealing with China's rise. So I would say that certainly in the foreseeable future, if these policies continue, the main beneficiary will be China. It will have opportunities to further expand its global presence and its global influence, because the US is leaving leaving a vacuum, leaving gaps all over the place. So, recently, I was a part of a India-EU dialogue. And in this dialogue, it is quite interesting that, while the EU has been looking at China as a kind of what they call a security risk, that this must be dealt with, not to cut yourself away from China, but you must regard it as a kind of a strategic challenge. Today, certainly, I think Europe is once again looking at China as perhaps an answer to the kind of pressures that they are going to be facing from the United States of America. So that's an important change. So the kind of challenges which Europe will be facing, many of the people in Europe are thinking, maybe it may not be a bad idea to actually strengthen our cooperation with China in dealing with, for example, the climate change issue, which Europe, gives a great deal of priority to. I find that there are people saying that, if we really want to achieve our targets, which are quite ambitious targets, why not work together with China? In terms of, the kind of advances it has made, for example, in solar energy, the advances it has been able to make in electronic vehicles. So these are trends we should pay attention to, that there is a certain realignment which seems to be already taking place.
So where does that leave us? I mean, you have written that China looks at us from a very different lens. I mean, there is a historical mistrust. There is also, in the past, scholars have called as a fallen nation or enslaved nation, which is not able to innovate or compete in the modern world. So there is a bit of looking down upon us. And so how do you see this relationship, and vis-a-vis, again, because we seem to be the counterbalance as a large economy and country, the major counterbalance in this region to China, as the West sees it?
So I have said before, that China's view of power is very hierarchical. It has very little patience with multipolarity, which we say we have an instinctive preference for. Their rhetoric may be multipolarity, but that is not the reality. So essentially, they want to be at the head of the pile. So if the United States of America has been, at that top place, China wishes to be the one which replaces the United States of America at that place. Now, if China is looking at India, it is looking at India more and more through the prism of its relationship with the United States of America. So it's not that it is looking at India as a kind of a peer rival. It is not looking at India as being in the same league as China. And yes, it is true, we are still quite far behind, but it is looking at India as a threat because it is working together with the United States of America. So it's not an independent threat. So in that context, sometimes when the pressure on China increases, a sense of vulnerability increases, it looks to try and somehow ameliorate the relationship with India. When that pressure is less, it feels more confident of being able to deal with the United States of America, then it does not pay much attention to what India's sensitivities would be. So I think you see some of that playing out now itself. you had 4 years of China resisting, for example, India's insistence that in terms of normalization of relations, the resumption of patrolling to the areas where our patrols were going earlier, Demchok, for example, Depsang Plains, for example, they resisted it for nearly 4 years.
Yeah.
The fact that they agreed, but yes, agreed with certain conditions, is a little shift in this. And you see that there was that made it possible for the Prime Minister to meet, Xi Jinping in Kazan. There has been a resumption of high-level, official engagement between the two sides. So why is this happening? This is happening because there is a sense that maybe, if India comes even closer together with the United States of America, this will be something which will be inimical to Chinese interests. So they look upon the India-China relationship in a very geopolitical frame.
Yeah.
It's not just bilateralism. Bilateralism is there, but I think that geopolitical context becomes very important. And there, as I said, India is being looked at today and more through the prism of China's relations with the United States of America.
Which means that it leaves us hardly any choice but to be closer to the United States in some sense. How does it leave our doctrine of strategic autonomy then?
So, I think every country tries both external balancing as well as, domestic balancing. The key should be domestic balancing.
Yeah.
Because unless you develop your own capabilities, whether it is your economic capabilities, technological capabilities, your own political coherence as a society, as a country, how united you are as a people, these are the things which matter. And I think there is no doubt that there is a large gap between India and China in terms of those capabilities. It is not that you must make up that gap or even surpass China, but you should be at least seen as reducing that gap. That if the world sees that you are reducing that gap, that itself expands your diplomatic space. And I experienced it myself during the period when I was foreign secretary. India was still behind China.
Yeah.
But what was difference was at that time, we were growing at the rate of 8 to 9% per annum.
Yeah.
Not only in India, but rest of the world saw India as the next China. If you remember the rhetoric at that.
Yes. 2003 is when 2003 is when the BRICS report came out and India was supposed to be part of this. Yeah.
Also, I would say, as someone who was very closely involved, as you said, in the negotiation of the Indo-US nuclear deal, which was a landmark agreement.
Yeah.
I still maintain that particular agreement would not have been possible, but for that particular, geopolitical context, that India was seen as actually a democratic country, which was making up, and reducing the gap with China. So that gave us a tremendous amount of diplomatic space. We lost that after the global financial and economic crisis. Because while China was able to bounce back to a much higher rate of growth, 6%, 7% per annum, our high rate of growth then slowed down.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is one aspect, that the gap started increasing rather than decreasing. Secondly, very importantly, in the geopolitical context, the gap between the United States and China started decreasing.
Yes.
Okay. So it is not therefore surprising that from that period onwards, you see a Chinese sense that, look, we are no longer at the margins of this geopolitical space. We are now moving towards the center of that space, and we can actually have much greater agency in shaping the world around us than we have had before. So that context changed. Domestic balancing still, to my mind, remains important. Is India able to get back to a more accelerated rate of growth? not necessarily to surpass China, but is it seen as actually on the road to reducing that gap? That is very important. In the meantime, what do you do? In the meantime, there is no alternative but to do external balancing, which means who are the other countries, powers who share our concerns about what may be happening around us, who are ready to work together with us to create a more balanced kind of a international, order or a regional order. And there is no doubt that the United States is the most significant power in that respect. And unpredictability of Trump may be there. We may also be not very certain what he will do. But I would say on balance, it appears from the initial sort of developments which we see that the United States of America continues to be interested in working closely together with India. Right? The fact that the Prime Minister will be perhaps one of the first heads of state and government to be visiting Washington after the inauguration of the president. The fact that immediately after the inauguration, there was a meeting with the new Secretary of State. There was the meeting of the Quad foreign ministers. There was a commitment not only to strengthening the Quad, but taking it forward, having the next summit, which is due to take place sometime in India. These are indications that despite the uncertainties and despite the flux which is taking place, at least it would appear that the US interest in working together with India still remains intact.
Since you mentioned the nuclear deal, I think one of the reasons why we are probably now, after many, many years, we are again looking at the liability provisions and all of this is probably part of this, of trying to assuage some of the concerns which the US and others had earlier.
Well, the civil nuclear liability bill was actually responding to a concern which was not actually very valid, because the background to the International Civil Liability Convention, which is under the IAEA, that was a response to the Chernobyl disaster. So it had nothing to do with the Indo-US nuclear deal. And the idea of that international convention was that you should create an international fund which can be drawn upon by various countries who have nuclear, plants in on their territory. But for being able to access that, they should have a kind of an enabling domestic legislation, a domestic civil nuclear liability legislation, which would do two things. One, it would make the operator functionally, not legally responsible for distributing assistance immediately after an accident occurs, even while you are looking at what may have been the cause of that particular accident. Was it a design defect? Was it an equipment defect? Even while that is being determined, you would have, assistance which would be distributed to people who have been affected by the operator. So he's, in a sense, functionally responsible. Secondly, the legislation should say what is the extent to which this domestic, fund for distribution to those affected will be determined. So if maybe India would have, say, $500 million, but if you have $500 million, the operator would have to take an insurance in order to be able to meet that liability. Now, to meet that insurance premium, you would have to raise your tariff. So there is a certain issue of economic viability which determines what is the limit to which you would have in your domestic legislation. But if you have that domestic law, that entitles you to draw also upon the international fund. So this was the backdrop. Somehow or the other in India, because of the controversy over the Indo-US nuclear deal, it somehow got linked into that debate, and something which should not have been
Yeah.
This kind of political way in which it was handled actually had nothing to do with the liability, because in every nuclear contract that you have, say for example, in the contracts we have had in the past with the Russians, that liability is already part and parcel of the commercial contract. Okay.
Yeah.
So there was no international, kind of a law or a domestic law. So I think to the extent that we are able to walk back from that and get back to the original, intent of the domestic law, I think not only for the United States of America, because those concerns are not only with US partners, but also with the French and the others. In fact, US is no longer making any nuclear reactors. Westinghouse has sold that to Toshiba in Japan. So while there may be some components in the technology which will come from the United States, but essentially it is opening up the international commerce in nuclear energy, which was one of the objectives of the nuclear deal.
And also now that a lot of companies themselves have started getting into the space, like Microsoft and Amazon, all of them trying to build nuclear plants or take over and revive old nuclear plants, including the 3 Mile one. We are also, and one of the concerns is the requirement, the huge requirement of energy, as well as facing climate change and balancing these two. Would you one of the sort of climate change walls we have run up against again and again has been climate financing, and we have had sort of a failed COP, which many people are calling it a failed COP 29 in Baku. How do you see, and especially because a lot of major US financing institutions are pulling out of it, how do you see now financing happening? Do you see it happening? Do you see a lot of new arrangements probably taking place? What would happen now, especially because we needed a lot of money for this?
So the blunt answer to your question is, don't expect a penny from any of your affluent, Western partners. That has been the case right since the time we had the Copenhagen Climate Summit. Even the $100 billion that was promised, per year, hardly any of that amount was actually disbursed. And even the disbursement which was made, it was by repurposing funds which were already being, made available for developmental purposes, for other purposes. They started using even philanthropic flows. They also started including, private investment flows. So the whole intent of what was originally agreed upon in the Rio Convention was already overturned. So any expectation that, there would be large sums of money which will now be made available to developing countries, and as you said, what was supposed to be the climate finance COP, the demand for $1 trillion per year was reduced to $300 billion, and even that $300 billion, you don't know how exactly it is. So let us be realistic. Depressing as it may be, do not expect a penny from international finance. That is number one. There are good reasons, even if that international sort of support is not available, it makes sense for India to make an accelerated transition away from a fossil fuel pattern of economic growth to a pattern of economic growth which is more and more, progressively more and more, fueled by renewable sources of energy as well as cleaner sources of energy like nuclear energy. Why? Because you are so heavily dependent. If you take oil, for example, you are almost like, 95 or 96% dependence on, foreign imports. That's not energy security. It's the same thing with the gas as well.
Yes.
Our domestic supplies are not able to expand fast enough to meet the expanding demand.
Yeah.
And even if we say we have lots of coal,
yeah,
most of the new coal-based thermal power plants, which are so-called supercritical or ultra supercritical, they need the kind of coal, high quality coal, low ash content coal, which is not available.
Yeah.
So we are even importing, as you must have seen, a lot of coal from outside. So bottom line is, even if there was not a climate change imperative, energy security imperative, in fact, pushes you in that direction. And there is a collateral benefit, therefore, on climate change as well. So there are enough reasons why India, even if it does not have that support from the international, regime, that you should take this path. As far as having a benign and supportive global climate change regime is concerned, that was not the case in the past, and it is even less the case today. There is a major setback. With Trump coming to power, there is a major setback, not only in the United States, but across the world, because, there are companies in Europe which are saying, well, this will give an even greater competitive advantage toward the American companies than they have. So why should you regulate us, to our disadvantage?
Yeah.
You see this argument now being used, all across Europe. So Europe, which was in some sense a leader in climate change action, is also, stepping back.
But that wouldn't mean that we can see border taxes reducing or going away. Or do you think there is any negotiation there? No, it's
no. I mean, as I mentioned, the recent interaction that we had with the EU, this matter came up, and it was quite clear that they are determined to go ahead with it.
But do you think they would agree to something like keeping the funds in India, that kind of mechanism which we were talking about, that we will administer it within the country? They would not.
No, I have not seen any indication of that.
Which means that
my sense is that, yes, if there are good business reasons, because companies see a opportunity in India to make profit through bringing clean tech into India, investing in, say, renewable energy in India, and there is some investment which is coming in on the solar side. If there is a business case, yes, capital will come. In any case,
which means that Indian companies should be prepared to live with higher costs and maybe even rules of origins, in the sense that tracing origins and all of that, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand.
I said Indian companies should be willing to live with higher cost of, because of the carbon taxes, either in terms of, putting mitigation or other measures in place here, especially steel companies and all that.
Well, as I mentioned, to the extent that it further drives that transition that I was talking about, it will only reinforce the argument that India should make that transition. So there is every reason why we should. And by the way, in India's case, there is also the air pollution issue.
Absolutely.
Which is linked to this. Pollution issue is very much linked to, the climate change issue as well. But I will say this, that as someone who has been following, climate change, for the last several years, today I'm much more pessimistic than I have been for some time, because we have already crossed that 1.5 degrees centigrade, level. The Hansen, who used to be the NSA scientist, who actually for the first time brought this whole aspect of, climate change being a great, environmental, challenge. He said recently that by 2045 or 2040 or 2045, we are already going to cross 2 degrees centigrade. And you have seen the kind of impacts that we have had in the last 2 years, the hottest years that we have ever experienced, in history, in a sense. So there is a almost, I would say, like a collective blindness. And I don't exclude India from that. There is a collective blindness about the kind of catastrophic future that we are facing, and this is where I talk about the technological arrogance, that somehow a sense that we have got mastered AI, and somehow or the other it will find a solution to this. No, I don't think so. The world will probably fry before artificial intelligence is able to find any kind of solution.
Well, I'll just toss it back to IG, because I think I have run out of my allotted time, and he has some audience questions.
No, thank you. Thank you, Dinesh. It's been a scintillating conversation so far. Thank you, Mr. Saran, for some of the very, very interesting perspectives. The clarity of thought was outstanding. I have two questions that I'd like to pick up. One is, of course, from our contributor, Vivek Kelkar, where he's asking, how do you see India in the next 4 years negotiating its way, given that our Indian industry has a growing dependence on China, and a Trump-led US, which is transactional with India and relatively tough on China? How do we kind of balance that? Because you spoke about how China views power as very hierarchical sort of manner, and the US relationship with India is also very crucial. So any thoughts on that? There's another allied question, but we'll come to that based on what we hear from you.
So if you are balancing economic interest and security, pursuit of security sometimes demands a price. So to feel that somehow we can have both, I'm afraid that's not really the case. And China has shown itself very willing to use economic and commercial relations as leverage, political leverage. It has done so. If you see recently, even though we have given visas for Chinese technicians to come for the Apple units in India, the Chinese government is not giving exit permits to those Chinese personnel to come to India. You have seen that with respect to some items of equipment that India has been importing from China, we have suddenly been seeing restrictions being imposed. So given that reality, I think to believe that somehow there will be no price to be paid for safeguarding our security, that is a wrong assumption. We should be prepared to pay some of that price. Now, in that context, even if you see a more transactional Trump, even if you see a more transactional United States of America, I think there seems to be some confidence on our side that having dealt with Trump in the first term, and one would say successfully navigated that particular period, there seems to be belief that we can do so again. So I do think that the economic collaboration that we have with the US, particularly the technological collaboration that we have, which has become very, very dense now, very broad ranging, I think that will continue to be very important for India, and India should, wherever possible, take advantage of that. I would also say this, that even if you are going to have a very protectionist Trump, and there is no doubt that we are going to see the United States of America, which is going to turn more and more protectionist. Now, what is happening in the rest of the world is that these policy directions in the US is not necessarily leading to the end of globalization. What it is leading to is a restructuring of the supply chains so that there is a minimal exposure to the US links in those supply chains, wherever possible. In some cases, it may not be possible, but in many cases, I think you already see that kind of restructuring taking place. So that restructuring is through more regional trading arrangements. So, for example, the CPTPP, which is successor to the TPP, you have the RCEP itself in Asia. You have Mercosur in Latin America. You have the European Union. Now the European Union is looking at how it can work together with Mercosur. So what I see happening is not so much a retreat of globalization, but a kind of a restructuring of that globalization, essentially through these kind of regional trading arrangements. Right. Now, the lesson for India is you better become part of these kind of arrangements. Otherwise, you are going to be marginalized. So I've been a great, sort of champion of India becoming part of the RCEP. Also, I think we should apply even to become part of the CPTPP. That sounds very ambitious, but the kind of situation we are facing calls for very bold kind of decisions. So the argument, for example, oh, this will become like a free trade, with China. So you look at the counter argument. If you were in part of the RCEP, there would be a constraint on China, not on a bilateral basis, but you would be, working together with many other partners who also want to put a constraint on China.
That's right.
So you would have perhaps greater leverage, relatively speaking, greater leverage if you are part of the trading arrangement. Okay. Second thing which many people forget is that with these partner countries, if China is inside, it has preferential market access to those countries, and our access to those markets becomes then less preferential because we are not part of that arrangement. So how does it work in our trade interests? So there is perhaps a different way of thinking about, how do we advance our trading interests? Because the fact is today that we are on the margins of the Asian economy. And the Asian economy is the most dynamic economic area in the world. So does it make sense that you are not seen as a important player? Whatever the government may think that we are a very major economic presence because we are going to be the third largest global economy. But are you a third largest trading economy?
Yeah.
So this is something which requires, to my mind, requires some rethink.
But this is where the government, I'm guessing, needs to work with Indian industry because there's still enormous resistance. No one is talking about getting back to RCEP. And you make a very valid point that we need to be open to these kind of regional trading blocks. But Indian industry seems to be largely lobbying the government to block such participation in.
Well, it seems that the lessons of 1991, 92 are being forgotten.
Yes, absolutely.
They are the same big companies at that time. If you remember, they were very strenuously opposed to those economic liberalization and reform measures.
Yes.
And yet, which are the companies who made the maximum, benefit, who took the maximum benefit out of those?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think, we should not forget those.
Sure.
However much we want to, cocoon ourselves and, save ourselves from foreign competition, that is not the way to go forward.
Sure. So we'll quickly move on. We'll try and see if we can pack in more questions and shorter answers so that more questions can get addressed. Sandeep, please go ahead. You had a question.
Shyam, I got two questions actually, different. See, the history of last 1500 years shows that whichever country is advanced and engaged in developing original science and technology is always leading the world. Abbasid Empire in the 8th to 12th century, Florence in Renaissance Europe, UK, US in last 100 years. I won't go into the history. Indian scientists and Indian industrialists, with the exception of ISRO and couple of other small things here there, have looked at science and technology more in terms of how to reduce cost of something developed in the West, and not at all doing anything original here. So if we are not original inventors, and if we are just going to focus on cost reduction and looking at that as great innovation, how is India going to be strategically relevant in the center of the global economic and political game?
Sandeep, I look at the 1500 years of history that you are talking about somewhat differently. Because if, say, you take the Greeks, much of the knowledge systems that were developed in Greece then became the basis for the succeeding Roman Empire, which utilized a lot of the knowledge that it was able to get from Greece to develop that further and bring about not only innovations in terms of science and technology, but also innovations in terms of how to manage an empire, as it were. There was an innovation in a sense in the Roman Empire because the Greeks did not have the kind of empire that the Romans had, a very extensive empire, a multinational kind of and multi-ethnic kind of empire. That was the first kind of effort to try and see how that can be managed. When we talk about the Arab Renaissance, don't forget that the Arab Renaissance was very much fueled by the knowledge which was coming from Central Asia, the knowledge that was coming from India. After all, the Arab numerals are Indian numerals, or the concept of zero or the concept of a decimal, all that. Yes, the Arabs developed that, Khwarizmi and people like that, developed that further, but they built upon the knowledge systems that were already there, and which then became the basis for the kind of renaissance that they had. It is the Arabs who rediscovered Greek philosophy and Greek mathematics, which then became the basis for the Italian Renaissance and the Western Renaissance. So I think we should look upon history as being far more interconnected than perhaps we sometimes do. That it's not always, when we think about something being completely original, there are also origins which we perhaps forget about. The other point I would like to make is, if you look at technology itself and how countries develop their technological strengths, typically you have a trajectory where, in the first instance, you adopt technology because you don't have the technology. So wherever you can get it from, you adopt that technology. Then, after having adopted that technology, you try to assimilate that technology. There has to be a learning process. There has to be an ecosystem in which whatever you are adopting is then assimilated. It is only after you have assimilated that you can come to the stage where you become a generator of technology. Every country goes through, this kind of a trajectory. I mean, it may not be entirely stage by stage. Sometimes they are overlapping, but essentially this is the trajectory. Where has China scored over India? China brought technology from outside, but also ensured that it has an ecosystem in China where that technology being brought in is being assimilated, is being learned from. They were modest enough to realize that there was a lot of, gaps that they had. That is why they sent, the first thing that Deng Xiaoping did was to send huge numbers of Chinese students to American university at Chinese cost. So we unfortunately did not always develop that kind of a ecosystem. So you take the MiG aircraft. We brought in MiG aircraft from Russia under license. When the MiG got upgraded to, say, MiG 21 or MiG 27, what did we do? We made another licensing arrangement with the Russians. So there was a weakness in that we did not entirely develop that ecosystem. Now, you have, like you mentioned, the Indian Space Research Organization, or I would even say the atomic establishment. These are obviously domains of excellence in India. There's no doubt. But they are, like islands. They must not remain islands. They have to, they have to expand. They have to, become the path breakers for many others what we have been able to do is to keep that island of excellence, but it is surrounded by a sea of mediocrity. How can that work? So I feel that there is, in terms of our science and technology policy, there has not been enough understanding of that particular trajectory, which is fundamental. Thank you.
Super. Thank you so much. That was the point on islands of excellence is so well made. I have a question from David Judson, who's joining us from Austin, Texas. David, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. It's just a fascinating conversation and some head-spinning insights. I just would like to follow up on Dr. Waslakar's question a bit here on the prospects of India becoming a generator of technology or expanding on that. As I'm sure aware, we're going through the DeepSeek moment here in the United States, of shock after 24 hours after President Trump announces a $500 billion innovation, a startup in China knocks $1 trillion off the NASDAQ with a similar technology they developed for like less than $6 million. The comparison that some have made is to the Chandrayaan-3, where basically India was able to replicate a $4 billion US project for less than 100 million. So I guess the question there is to get beyond just the sort of simple dynamic of can you make something cheaper? Is there an efficient innovation dynamic here that, in a comparative sense, that India might seize upon and develop in the dynamics of what Ian Bremmer, as I'm sure you're familiar with his work, is called the technopolar moment. So that would be my question. Thank you.
So two things. I think DeepSeek points to the fact that today we are living in an age of very rapid technological diffusion. So any sense that you are somehow going to be able to prevent a new cutting-edge technology from being somehow confined to the originator, that is simply not possible any longer. So that diffusion is taking place, and taking place much more rapidly than were perhaps the case in the past. The other thing which DeepSeek shows, which also is similar to the Chandrayaan experiment by India, is that there is that what we call in India sense of jugaad, that because you don't have the kind of availability of massive resources, you try and make do with what you have, and sometimes you are able to do that quite well. The point that I was making was that while we are able to do this in certain specific domains, because there has been a heavy investment at the state level in those domains, we have not actually been very successful in generalizing that across the economy. So these have remained actually islands of excellence, despite the fact that they have been in existence for the last so many years. And somehow what we have done is, what in India is famously called the mission approach. So you instead of making certain that you have policies which bring about upgradation across the board, what you do is, okay, we want to make certain that our metro system is the world class. So you get hold of a very good manager, you put resources in that, and hey, presto, you get a world-class metro system. But that does not mean that you have revolutionized the whole public transportation system in India, which is what you really need. So this is I think the weakness in the Indian system, that we have not been able to create a kind of a ecosystem, I would say, where whatever we are able to bring together, we do not have a platform where we can actually spread that as quickly as possible. So a platform for bringing these national efforts together to scale up what you have been able to achieve is the kind of a managerial challenge that we have still not overcome.
Right. Thanks, David. Thank you, Mr. Saran. I'll go back to Dinesh. He has some more questions and then come back towards the end for a few more audience questions. Dinesh, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, I think I'm going to move away from technology for the moment and go back to a relationship, India's relationship with the Middle East, which has been one of the more success stories in the past 10 years. And after Syria and the developments which are happening there, I guess it is going to be one of the more action-packed regions once again, or it has been always, and it's probably continued to be one. How do you see that region? And we have an important IMEEC, that corridor, which a project which we have there. How do you see the dynamics playing out there, and what vis-a-vis India there?
Well, I am told that the part of the corridor which is from India to the Gulf countries, that is making progress. I think the problem is the more western segment of the corridor, because Israel is such an important part of that corridor. And I think the assumption was that finally Saudi Arabia and Israel will, normalize their relations. Knowing that Haifa was the terminus of this particular corridor, Saudi Arabia still was ready to fund a very large part of this project. So obviously, they also were looking at the possibility that eventually there will be a normalization of relations with Israel. I think both the Arab Gulf countries as well as Israel and the United States of America, the assumption that somehow or the other, the Palestinian issue had now become a non-issue was a very, shall I say, mistaken assumption. So it erupted with great fury. And today, no matter what you do, the Palestinian issue is very much back on the international agenda. They have come back through rather, very, very through this kind of indiscriminate violence and terrorism and the kind of reaction which we see from Israel. But the fact is that it's back on the table. Yeah. Now, I think in a sense, India's position with regard to the Gulf countries was also based on this assumption. That you had the I2 and U2.
I2, U2, yeah.
What was I2 and U2 based on? It was precisely that, we no longer had to choose between Israel and the Arab countries.
Yeah.
That we could do that on parallel tracks. And we were able to do it with quite successfully, as you yourself pointed out.
Yeah.
Now, that is now in question. Yeah. Can we still continue with that? One thing which has happened, which may have longer term consequences, is that in the recent few visits that I have made to the region, even though we don't have a problem in terms of this becoming an issue in the state-to-state relationship, but if you look at the popular sentiment in the Arab countries, which was always very positive and benign towards India, there has been cultural affinity, there has been, Bollywood has maybe played a role. There has been also a sense that India has always been, sort of supportive of Arab causes. That has taken a big knock.
Right.
So India is today being seen as being very complicit with the kind of brutality that you see Israel being engaged in. And it's not really raising its voice. Now, you can say, well, the Arab countries are not raising their voice. Why do you want me to raise my voice?
Right.
Yeah, true. I'm not contesting that, but I'm saying that to the extent that the benign and sentiment of the people of the Arab countries, the kind of goodwill that they have had for India for a long time, that seems to be getting undermined, and maybe that is something we should think about.
Perceptionally, it makes a big difference also, and the same thing has happened in the neighborhood as well, right? Similar sentiments, and now we seem to have, or seem to be losing Bangladesh as well. How do you see the neighborhood itself?
Well, Bangladesh
Losing might be a strong word, but yeah. Sorry.
I mean, Bangladesh, I know there are arguments that, why did we put all our eggs in one basket, and why did we not see this coming? See, don't forget that during Sheikh Hasina's, period in office, we made major advances in our relations with Bangladesh. In fact, one could say that the relationship was really transformed. For example, something which we did not have before, we have now, which is transit through Bangladesh territory to our northeastern states, which is a huge, gain for India. We have, for all practical purposes, we have also revived inland water transportation, which was the lifeline of this region in the past, if you remember, which had fallen, into disuse. Much of that has been revived, again, thanks to cooperation between India and Bangladesh. The security issue for India was substantially,
Yes.
And again, a major gain. So, if there was a window of opportunity which that period under Sheikh Hasina provided to India, that was, utilized rather, I think, productively by both sides. India, for example, became a major supplier of power to Bangladesh. So the emergence of Bangladesh as a major textile power owes very much to it's being able to get power supplies from India. Now, even though the political pendulum has swung to one side, I see that much of those linkages which were established during that period have actually continued to survive. So there is no problem as far as I see with regard to the power supply. Even the Adani power issue has been sort of managed. After the change of government in Bangladesh, you may have noted that a three-way MOU was signed in Kathmandu, where power from Nepal could go through the grid system to Bangladesh. This has happened after the change that has taken place. So I think there is a realization in Bangladesh also that there are big advantages that accrue to Bangladesh as a result of all these cross-border linkages which have been put in place. And to me, that I think once the heat of the moment begins to recede, I think this very strong cross-border engagement that we have, I think will play its role in stabilizing the relation. After all, this is what happened with the Maldives.
Yes.
The Maldives, Government came into power on the basis of India Out campaign.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And several hostile, actions were taken.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Now, then the realization came that actually this relationship with India is very critical for the Maldives. So take, for example, the helicopter issue.
Yeah.
One great, service that helicopter squadron provided was the medical evacuation, because these are far-flung islands. If there is a medical emergency, how do you make certain that you are able to get the person concerned, to a hospital as quickly as possible? This is what the role was being played by, the helicopters which were stationed there in the Maldives. When a couple of people died as a result of not being able to get evacuated, then that became a political liability.
Absolutely.
Or the fact that the Maldives, not the big five-star hotels, but the general population of the Maldives has easy access to essential goods from India, food and other items from India at very, cheap rates. If that is not available, then your inflation rate is going to go up.
Yeah.
Now, India, I think, to be fair, also did not react too sharply, to all these very hostile statements. We kept our cool. And I think, the relationship has, maybe not the same as before, but it has certainly become a much more normal relationship, to the extent that the president of the Maldives comes to India on a visit. Yeah.
Yeah.
With Sri Lanka, I think it would also be fair to say that the promptness with which India acted during the period of severe crisis in Sri Lanka, by making available through a swap arrangement, foreign exchange, or fuel supplies, or even rice and other essential commodities, that played a very important role in changing the perception about India. And I was conscious of this when I visited Sri Lanka some time back, that there was a change. Sentiment had undergone a change, and even the new president, came to India, and so the relationship is on a fairly good positive level. So I would not say that India has done a very bad job in managing its neighbors. It is always a complicated relationship with each of our neighbors, but by and large, I would say, given the kind of a situation we have faced, I think I would give some credit to the government of having been fairly prompt and quite agile in reacting to it. The one exception, of course, is Pakistan.
I was just seeing
because I certainly believe that there is a good case for re-engaging Pakistan at this point of time, because Pakistan is under huge amount of pressure. And perhaps there are possibilities that we can explore in not necessarily establishing a very friendly relationship, but at least managing what is still a essentially adversarial relationship, but which does not preclude both sides from benefiting from, the same kind of cross-border linkages that I spoke about with Bangladesh. There is enough logic for that with Pakistan as well.
Sir, my last question, what does it take to be an Indian diplomat today in this time? I mean, in the sense that also, because I'm asking this question with a certain background, because the Indian Home Minister, the Indian NSA, and the second richest man in India find it difficult to step into the United States today because of the cases and all that. So I'm saying it's a tough time for India. What does it take really?
No, I mean, as a diplomat, you have to be ready to deal with all kinds of very difficult and tricky situations. What I would say is, my experience has been that, remaining engaged, ultimately diplomacy is, relations between human beings. So if you have managed to establish that kind of relationship with your counterparts. Importance of credibility is to be noted, that you need not necessarily be always very friendly, but you should be credible. That is, what you say, the other side can trust what you are saying. I have found that in very difficult situations, those kind of personal relationships that you have established, a relationship of trust, a relationship of credibility, that plays a very important role, especially at times when the relationship may be tense, relationship may be perhaps confrontational. You need those kind of conversations, because diplomacy is to prevent war. War means a failure of diplomacy. So also the role of the diplomat is that even if there is a very tense situation, confrontational situation, his role is to try and lower the temperature, not be party to raising that temperature. I know that sometimes diplomats play that role, but that is not diplomacy. You're not a propagandist. That is not your role. Your role is really to manage your relationship with as you say, a very difficult world, a very challenging kind of an international environment, by using those skills of diplomacy. That is not always very easy, but I think it is. I believe that diplomacy today is perhaps even more relevant than it has been in the past, precisely because of the kind of situation that we face.
Thank you, Mr. Saran. Back to you, IG.
Thank you, Mr. Saran, Dinesh. What a lovely session and a note to end on. You spoke about human relationships. You started the conversation talking about collaborative systems that we seem to be kind of missing. That's essentially, and relationships of trust and credibility that will hopefully help us weather some of the challenges that face humanity and that we're kind of faced with in 2025 and beyond. So thank you so much for sharing your perspective. We'll love to have you back at some stage. I just wanted to share that this recording of this conversation, for those of you who couldn't join, will be made available tonight itself, and we will supplement it with a handcrafted summary, and hopefully with some help from AI as well, no harm. And that will come to you very soon. Before I kind of bid you all goodbye, thank you so much for joining. We have a very interesting story planned tomorrow as part of our weekend edition, where we're essentially looking at something that got discussed here today, but from a different lens, AI. How do you kind of leverage the power of AI and embrace it and make it part of our lives? The technology is here to stay. And it's important that each of us, as individuals, as organizations, we learn to embrace it. So the story comes out tomorrow, and we will follow it up with a conversation of this kind at Founding Fuel Live on the 17th, where Tanuj Bhojwani and Anmol Srivastava, both are contributors and very respected names in the technology space, will lead that discussion. Do join us again. But on this note, thank you, Mr. Saran. Thanks, Dinesh. Lovely to listen to this